I'll stop talking.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA on this Wednesday evening. I'm your host, David Allen Picali. It's great to have you along here for my chat with Alex, or Alexander Thorpe, as he's more formally known in the publishing world for his fantastic new, what would you call this, a thriller, mystery, locked room, cozy crime drama. Death
I
Holds-
call,
what would you call
yeah, I
it?
call it a lot of things. I call it a cozy crime usually, or a whodunit, or it depends who I'm talking to. If I feel like someone's going to be on my level, I'm like, yeah, it's a locked room murder mystery, and other times I'm like, oh, it's an Agatha Christie type thing. Yeah.
Well, we've got a lot of questions to get through tonight, Alex, and also just to encourage everybody, this is a completely interactive chat. If you're in the audience tonight and you want to know anything about the book, about Alex's writing process, how his brain works, how he invented this incredible sort of Rube Goldberg machine of intersecting plot lines, please jump in the chat and ask us a question. But before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am broadcasting to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. And pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Really great to have you all along tonight, and a pleasure to have you along here tonight, Alex. How are you going these days? What's happening?
Yeah, I'm good. Not a lot's happening. It feels a strange sort of eye of the storm situation. Obviously, you get all that stuff leading up to publication time, and then you have these events like this. But in the meantime, I haven't been doing any writing at the moment. I've just been, doing promotional stuff, and as we were discussing before, I've got a 2.5-year-old, and that takes up, as you know, so much, so much of your time and energy. So I feel strangely, yeah, as I said, strangely calm in the middle of lots of things happening.
Well, I'm glad you're calm because, hang on.
Uh,
Death Holds the Key certainly is not. And I must say, I was very appreciative that this book exists because I greatly enjoyed your debut, Death Leaves the Station.
Thank
Death
you.
is a big theme, but so is one particular character who came across from Leaves the Station. Can you tell us what Death Holds the Key is about and how that one particular character translated across?
Yeah, so Death Holds the Key is, I would describe it as sort of a locked room murder mystery, a classic cozy murder mystery. It's also a period piece, so it's set in 1928 in the southwest of Western Australia. So it's a little bit different. You often have that idea of the sort of English country house, or a lot of these things set in London, whereas this one's yeah, very much an Australian story. And I suppose the complicating factors, as I said, it's a locked room murder mystery. So a man's killed in a room with all the doors and windows locked. There's no trace of any weapon or someone, getting in or out. So the mystery becomes, how was the murder committed? But there's the extra layer of the fact that the guy who was killed was just a bastard and everyone hated him. So it's everyone has the motive basically in town. He's just a widely hated man. Um, and it ties in. Yes, you don't have to have read Death Leaves the Station to read Death Holds the Key. They're definitely work as standalones, but yeah, there is a character who carries over, who is our sort of our amateur sleuth. He's our version of Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple. Yeah, and he's an interesting character.
We call him he's a mendicant monk. He's
Mm-hmm.
not a monk as well, but he's also kind of the man with no name. Call me whatever you wish. The friar.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I actually stole from Doctor Who. I was a massive Doctor. I'm still a big Doctor Who fan, but growing up, I was hugely into Doctor Who. The fourth one was my favorite. I was a Tom Baker guy. But
Scarf. Yes.
classic. Um, but what I noticed, after watching years and years of Doctor Who, is that it's a really interesting narrative shorthand. Because when you introduce a new character, there's always you don't want to be clumsy with the exposition. You don't want to be like, "Hello, it's me, the man who feels strongly about this thing and reacts to things this way." Like it's an awkward thing to do. So what I always found in Doctor Who is that the Doctor always bursts in a weird way, and he says, "I'm the Doctor," and they say, "What's your name?" Doctor Who, and he's like, "No, just the Doctor." And the way people react to that is really revealing about if they're really sort of militaristic and hierarchy oriented. They're sort of like, oh, this is not orthodox. This isn't the done thing, and they'll get sort of, oh, if they're very kind of like, adaptable and go with the flow, they'll be like, great, doctor it is, and they'll just sort of switch on. So it became like a really quick and easy way to sort of introduce characters and to tell quite a lot about their character without really having them say much. So I nicked that, basically, because the old good artist steal, because I thought it was just a really useful thing. So the whole idea behind having the mendicant, the monk, the friar, whatever we call him, have no name is A, it just adds another layer of mystery, and it sort of, it compounds things and keeps things sort of like, keeps people on their toes. Yeah, but B, it just really helps to sort of to create that, to be revealing about the other characters by showing how they respond to that unknown variable.
When we meet the friar, when Detective Hartley first meets him, he's had 3 or 4 pints of stout and he kind of just stumbles upon his camp. But the friar's not in town for the murder in particular, is he? Though Detective Hartley definitely is. We start the book with the detective. Can you tell us a little bit about our man from the law? His first act is to slip over.
Yeah, he's not the best. He's he's supposed to be. I suppose Hartley, it's his first gig. He's just been promoted to detective from being just a regular police officer, and he's determined to make a good impression. He's quite earnest. He's quite young, but he I would say he's not cut out to be a police officer, and that sort of becomes clear pretty quickly in the book. He's a bit too maybe trusting, a bit too kind, whatever but he's working really hard to sort of portray, to live up to this his station and everything. He's very so I think where in books like this, when you have Lestrade, and you have that classic dynamic of sort of amateur sleuth who really knows what they're doing and is really on top of things, and the police officer's job is often to sort of be that foil to them and look a bit clumsy and show how smart the detective is by not quite being there. There was I'm trying to remember who was. Someone was writing an essay about crime fiction, and they said that the job of the Watson, as like the narrator, is to be of average intelligence, basically no smarter than the least intelligent reader, because it sort of shows how adept the detective is and how comfortable they are sort of navigating these clues and these unorthodox situations.
And I love the opening line of Death Holds the Key, where you have the prologue. It says, the exact nature of the northeast room at Tolhurst had always been the subject of some dispute. So it just sort of sets you up quite nice. And then you've got a diagram. You've got a map of the room.
Yeah,
straight up, we've got the locked room. We've got the place of the murder. We've got a strange death. It's a completely locked room. How was this, as you say, this awful bastard killed? What a setup. Is this something that you constructed for yourself, or were you led to?
So I did the first the book with Death Leaves the Station. It was kind of the opposite of this, almost. Like the problem was that there was someone who was found dead in the middle of nowhere, further up in the wheat belt, up in the Midwest, and it was all about space and possibility. Could have been anyone, could have been anyhow. Where did they come from? Where did they go? Where they come from, Cotton Eye Joe, and all the rest of it. But so it seemed like the natural thing to do was to go the opposite, and have a very restricted that locked room thing. But also just, it's something that I've always loved. I've always been a huge fan of all kinds of murder mystery and crime fiction. And this is, I think every writer that I love has kind of their own take on this, or more than one take on this locked room thing. And I kind of wanted to see if I could do it. And so that's what kind of led me to doing that. I find when I write anything, when I try to write novels or short stories or whatever, if I don't have a strong structure, I really go off the rails and it just ends up being terrible. The first couple of stories I tried to write that were novel length manuscripts that never sort of got anywhere. I didn't even submit them for publication, I think, because they were too terrible. I was bringing characters at different times and I was trying different styles and all this sort of stuff. And I found that having, something like a whodunit, especially a locked room one, has such a strong structure. That has to start with, the body being discovered. That has to end with finding out who did it, and there's a pretty clear set of steps you need to do to get to that point with all of your red herrings and so on. So I found that having that strong structure is really something I need, I think, to keep me in check.
It's true. A note I wrote was that what I really enjoyed about the key was I knew where I was going, but I had no idea how I was getting there. Like it
Yeah,
was,
right.
yeah, it was. You've got all of the elements, but you're playing with them constantly. And I never quite trusted the writing. If you take my meaning, it was like, oh, what's next? Oh, what's going on here? But at the same time, it was comfortable ground as well as being very uncomfortable. So I really enjoyed that sort of play that you had there with it.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's part of the thing, isn't it? With sort of knowing how everything's sort of supposed to go, then you can kind of mess things around. I've always found, and I'm sure you've heard 100,000 times, being a writer, that people tell you that if anything's not necessary, you should cut it out. And there's all of Hemingway's stuff is very sort of like spare, and there's all the Chekhov thing of like you shouldn't have a gun in the background unless it gets fired. And I like that murder mysteries kind of give you the option to, or they kind of make you disobey that, because
Yeah.
if you only talk about the things that are important and you only talk about the things that are actually relevant to the plot, then it's very obvious what's going to happen. So you have to have, a character look at a vase and be like, wow, interesting vase. Let's describe that for a while. And you're like, oh, that's going to come in handy. That's going to go somewhere. And then it never does. So yeah, I like that aspect of it.
That's great. That's great. And can you tell us a little more about the murder at the center of Death Holds the Key? Because uh, Detective Hartley, he's sort of it's thrust upon him, and he investigates it quite conventionally at first, doesn't he?
Yeah. So basically, um, it is hard to talk about it without, because you don't want to sort of reveal too much. But
Yeah.
it's, I think part of the problem is that prior to the murder, there was a lot of strange stuff happening. And it's obviously, for those who don't know WA, Kojonup is, I mean, nowadays it's what, 3 hours drive away from Perth. Back then, it would have been like a full day's travel down Albany Highway. The Perth to Albany Road it was called. It wasn't Albany Highway. Yeah, I've got a very detail oriented editor. We work all this out beforehand. Um, but so he, yeah, so there's all this sort of like silly sounding stuff that people are talking about. Maybe the place is haunted, and there's a lot of people seeing things, and stumbling home from the pub and talking about all this sort of country town stuff. And when Hartley gets promoted to detective, he isn't particularly well liked or well regarded in the force. They think he's a bit young and a bit silly and stuff. So they actually kind of send him down almost as a punishment. And he has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder about that, because they're sort of like, this is obviously nothing. This is small town idiots being, being silly, overreacting, hysterical women, all the rest of it. And so he arrives down there, and he's sort of like, he's insecure about his ability to actually do his job. B, he doesn't think this is a real case. He doesn't think there's anything to investigate, because Fred O'Donnell hasn't actually been killed yet. There's just been threats and sort of some gunshots around the place and everything. And then, of course, very quickly it transpires, Fred is killed, and it transpires that it is a real, it's something to be taken seriously. And Hartley sort of struggles to kind of adapt to that, I think.
And when Hartley meets our itinerant monk, our mendicant monk, our friar, he embraces his help fairly quickly, which is I really enjoyed that dynamic between the two of them. It wasn't sort of a competition of pride. It was, oh, great, this guy can be, sort of my puncho to my donkey kind of thing. But then it like,
Yeah, I think he realizes how much he's out of his depth, and he will take anything at that point. And B, I think he's maybe a bit of a good judge of character, and can tell that quite quite quickly that the friar is very has perspicacity, and kind of has a good has that skill to tell what's going on and what lies beneath the surface. So and also, I mean, it's just, I think I did try and write a bit more of like him convincing him that, and it's just not that fun. It was just more fun to get right into it. So I thought, you know what, Hartley, he can just deal with it. Sorry, mate.
Well, from the joy of those two characters, really, to Fred O'Donnell, can we talk about this absolute bastard of, he's killed and everybody's immediately a suspect because they're all quite glad he's dead. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, what's Fred like?
So I
Well,
mean, Fred's awful. He's one of like he's basically, if you imagine just an awful old man. He's just everything that you would imagine of and I'm sure we've all had sort of people like that in our lives who are just just really dismissive of everyone else, especially anyone who's different to them in terms of culture, gender, race, background, belief, whatever. Um, he is yeah, just sort of set in his ways, but just very very aggressive about it. He had a hard sort of life, which comes into play a bit later on, hard upbringing, but that's not an excuse. It's kind of more of an explanation. But again, like with everything else, I kind of just started to have fun with it. Like the way it originally started is I wanted to have that as a complicating factor that everyone wanted to kill him, and I was like, well, how do you write someone that everyone wants to kill? And then in a small town, he's just he's made all these enemies. He's just been a big old jerk. And I'm sure a lot of people would say that writing villains or bad guys or whatever can just be a lot of fun. So I had a lot of fun with just like when different people are interviewed, we have the different reasons that they hate him, or just like all of the weird petty things he's done to people. And even though he's such an awful man, it starts to become a little bit of a recurring joke, sort of a fun thing. He's the different ways that he's just pissed everyone off in town, basically.
he's wealthy, he's very powerful and influential, and people are also scared of him. But it's also all concentrated at Tolhurst, his house. Can we talk about the place of
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned as well, we have the map at the start to kind of to show how that all fits together. I mean, I suppose it comes from this idea of, as I mentioned before, the classic sort of murder mystery being in an English country house. And I was like, well, we don't really have, there are exceptions, of course. There were, governors' houses and stuff, but in general, it's not as big a thing in Australia, especially back in the day. But in terms of the remoteness and maybe the size, something that comes close is those kind of big homesteads that often have an extended family living in them. And I've got family. I think because you're a sort of you're a country dude, aren't you? Originally, yeah,
country? No, I'm very
yeah.
much a soft-handed city boy from the birds, but I worked in the country. Yeah,
That's right. You're working remotely. See, I'm the same. So I've always just lived in the suburbs in Perth, but my mum's family are all farmers and they're all from Narrogin. So
yeah.
my grandparents had this when they were farming. I had this big old house, that had they had that thing that um, old like Anglo people have, where they have like a good room that's only there for like if the Queen comes or whatever. And I just remember being a kid and like we running around and playing in harvesters. I mean, we went up there on the on the holidays and running through all the rooms and stuff. But then there was the good room and you can't go in there. Even when like all the whole family came around for dinner, it's like that was not quite good enough. We're not worthy of the good room. Um, so yeah, it was kind of inspired by that and a lot of the other sort of houses that around that area. I didn't write about Narrogin because that felt a bit too close to home, but Kojonup felt like it's Narrogin-esque, but it's far enough away. Um, and they are, they can be beautiful. These old houses, they can be really gorgeous, but also obviously very functional in a way that like country houses in England and stuff often maybe aren't, or maybe the function is a bit removed. Whereas these ones you have the people walk straight in with their gumboots on and kick sheep poo all over the kitchen floor and stuff. So it's an interesting contrast, I suppose. These houses that are often quite big, quite elaborate in certain ways, but also still they're working class people, and it's still definitely a functioning farm.
It's 1928. It's that sort of it's the hangover of the First World War. The Depression is kind of just around the corner, but there's still that Victorian and Edwardian sensibility to all the buildings. And in my mind's eye, I kept picturing a lot of some of the pubs outside York, that have been 10 or 12 Ks out. But they're beautiful old piles, and that gentility contrasted with the bush and then the
Yeah,
So
and contrasted with all the sort of, racism and all the things that are going on at that time as well.
yeah, it's a fascinating period of history. What is it? Is it something that has hooked you, and or is it something that also that you can play with because of those intersections?
Yeah, I mean, I can never resist. I mean, but in both books, I sort of have some horrible, things where the people who've come back from World War One are like, well, at least things are getting better now, and at least we're we're set, like we're settling in for a good run, and you're like, because obviously they don't know what's coming around the corner. But it's an amazing, time in history, and it also has that the WA factor. So like when you're researching, you go, oh wait, would it be feasible for them to have, this technology? And you look it up and you're like, well, it was invented in 1924. But you're like, was that enough time for it to dissipate to not only Australia, but then like Western Australia and then rural Western Australia? I helped my other grandpa, my dad's dad, write his memoirs, and he grew up north and around on stations and farms and stuff. And he'd often be saying, oh, of course it was this was 1935. We didn't have telephones. And I was like, he had telephones. He's like, not outside Marlow, we didn't. And you're like, oh yeah, that's okay, fair enough. So it's an interesting time period because you do have, you have globally all of these really interesting things happening, and a lot of parallels to now in terms of, economic collapse, in terms of, a lot of the sort of rise in, populism, fascism, that kind of stuff, arguably in the US and all that sort of jazz. But also, just a really interesting period in time all around. And I think the way that people speak is interesting then as well. I have a lot of fun with, like older Australian people. They really have that sort of thing where they speaking like an upper class British person really kind of makes them feel, you know, grounded. And I think that's a really funny thing to play with, especially back in the day.
Well, they say more British than the British, and then
Yeah,
I always like hearing what older Australians particularly just saying to die when they say to die. Like,
Todaro. Yeah.
wow, so
I
um,
just my grandma, as I said, like on the farm, so we were always, we'd been like picking up dead lambs during the day and like mulesing and doing horribly visceral kind of stuff, and then you'd be eating dinner and she would like not snap at you, but she would like firmly correct you if you ended a sentence with a preposition. Like, who am I giving this to? And it's like, to whom am I giving this? And it's like, mate, I have got sheep guts on me. Like, I don't care. So, but that would be very important to, like that's something that for some reason was important to them.
that's right. Well, speaking of language, and is there a section you can read us? I think we talked about the funeral, because I think it introduces that sort of play on words, and ever so slight comedy of manners, which I really like. In the language.
Sure. You want me to go ahead and read that bit?
Uh, Far away.
I actually haven't read this. So just before I start, the first book I did, when you do your first one before you publish and before you send it off to a publisher, even you reading and rereading every single bit, and working so hard and spending years on it, and I did that. And then the second, I didn't have a kid then, and then the second one I wrote completely with a newborn basically, and so the first one I sort of know back to front. I went over every single word 100 times. Do I need this? And the second one, I basically just like planned it out, started writing, and as soon as I finished it, I was like, sent this off to George, made it, and I'm like, I don't want to think about this anymore. I can't. I'm tired. Like so.
Yeah, please.
I'm reading this again. And I'm like, oh, that's right. I forgot about that bit. All right. So this is the start of chapter 3. Hartley and his newfound partner stood at the threshold of St Mary's Anglican Church in Kojonup and peered inside. Save for the 2 frontmost pews, the building was deserted. Perhaps we have the wrong time, suggested the friar. I don't think so, said Hartley, digging a notebook out of his jacket pocket. No, here we are, 10 o'clock, Friday the 14th. He stepped back and cast an eye over the wooden entryway. Could be the wrong church, I suppose. Very few of my Roman brethren would refer to it as the right one, certainly, the friar muttered, but this is hardly the occasion to succumb to sectarian debate. It was the occasion, ostensibly, for mourning. The 2 investigators had arisen early and driven for several hours to get to Kojonup in time for the funeral. But there wasn't much time. There wasn't much before them in the near-empty nave to suggest that a ceremony was imminent. They may be running behind time. Hartley tapped his wristwatch. As if summoned by the gesture, a granite-faced man emerged from the shadows. Fred O'Donnell, intoned the man, whose black, weighty attire marked him as a minister. No, Hartley. Detective Constable Hartley, the policeman replied automatically. He was on the verge of extending his hand when the meaning of the minister's query dawned on him. Oh, yeah, I see. Sorry. He fought the ill-timed urge to laugh off his own error. Yes, we're here to farewell Mr. O'Donnell. Are we in the right place? And, carries on from there.
And it just, I laughed because of the awkwardness, because of that I don't know, that Wodehousey kind of uh, delight in the language, but at the same time, it was it's thematic. Perhaps I'm reading into it a bit too much. Yeah, this is a book club, right? It's thematic. It's mistaken identities, and then he's also a man in black. He's a cloaked figure. He's emerging from the
True.
shadows. He's got a granite face. There's, like you said before, you can introduce certain things and it not mean anything, but it can also mean something.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's and again, I think that's just part of the playfulness, I suppose, of this genre that I really like, that I love. And you mentioned like the Jeeves and Wooster books, a big one as well. Again, with that sort of that playing with language and that era, I suppose that's another reason that I chose that. Was a big fan of anything where you have the kind of odd couple. You've got Jeeves and Wooster, or Holmes and Watson, and even kind of later on, like one of my favorite books when I was a kid was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and even Ford and Arthur. There's a bit of that kind of like straight man sort of eccentric thing in there. I don't think it ever gets old.
Definitely not. And look, to be a bit of an armchair psychoanalyst, but your experiences as a young guy going out to your grandparents' farm and being corrected in your English and playing, that must have had an influence on it, at least in your mind's eye. And were you playing at detective stories or wondering at mysteries when you were out in that environment?
Yeah, I think always. Although maybe the kind of the route that I take to detective stuff is more from the kind of puzzle side than the murder side. I know people who, my wife is really into just murder, and she's always listening to murder podcasts and reading true crimes, stuff, and it's very quite like visceral and focused on the murder thing. I'm really squeamish, and I'm actually not. I'm very much focusing on the. Speaking of murder, my toddler is being killed in the next room. I can just hear her through the wall. She's tickling. But the kind of crosswords and sort of riddles and logic puzzles and stuff is kind of more the side of things that appeal to me. But no, definitely a huge reader as a kid, and I was terrible at anything. I was terrible at sport, terrible at anything kind of physical. So that was my that was how I kind of defined myself and related to other people and everything, was sort of by being sort of well read for my age and having fun with language and all the rest of it.
Oh, I love that. And look, this I swear I didn't plan this, but I picked out some books from my own that I found elements of. So we Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which is
Incredible. Love that one. Yep.
lyrically beautiful, written, but which very present in your writing here.
Yeah. That's good.
Georges Simenon, the Maigret stories, that sort of
I
procedure.
actually haven't read that one. That's on my list. I haven't actually got no.
They're joyful as well. It's got that French repartee as well. And then
Yeah.
what's the 11th Hour, which I've never
Yeah.
sold. Please tell me
Oh
you.
yeah. I never. No, I must have. There was that one because it was Animalia as well. Was another Graham Base one that was. Hey, there we go. That one, yeah, I had a lot of fun with. I'm trying to remember how I went with the 11th Hour.
But I bring the 11th Hour up just because it's the mystery of it, but it's also the aesthetic. It's
Yeah,
that Victorian, Edwardian, you know, lashings of ginger beer and ham sandwiches kind of thing, and then an incredible,
totally.
uh, you know, the joy of that sort of is infused in your writing.
Hugely, yeah. It's funny how much because now that we've got kids and we're reading to them and stuff, the amount of kids books that I read that were written like 100 years before I was born. I was like, it's weird that we were still, yeah, and like often when I don't know, like I go back and read or look at some of the kids books that I was, you know, being read as a kid or reading as a kid, I was like, these are very they're very involved and they're very heavy, and there's like I feel like we've really sort of changed turned a corner there in terms of trying to make things that are a lot more accessible to kids now. I mean, even though things, as you said, like all of the Enid Blyton, like the famous five and all that kind of stuff were very engaging in that they grabbed you. But I imagine that we all sort of blew past a lot of vocabulary and a lot of themes that probably weren't that exciting for kids.
And was it interesting to also in Death Holds the Key and also Death Leaves the Station to go to that era with that joy, with that sensibility, with those aesthetics, but also with the knowledge of the truth of these times and the different elements that you could play with, set a murder in these settings, and then use that to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the really hard things is obviously looking back at so much of the stuff that you sort of taught is great and positive and noble and everything as a kid. Reading all the Beagle stories and all of that sort of stuff, and it's all hugely steeped in like colonialism and things that you learn to be really critical of later on. And you're sort of like, how can I work in this time period that where yeah, like as I said, like the way that these people talk and dress and everything, can be really fun and can be really enjoyable for us, but it's built on the backs of you know, domestic service and colonialism and all this stuff that's not to be that we really shouldn't be romanticizing. So it's it gives an opportunity, I suppose, to kind of dig into that and examine those issues as well. And it's finding a balance, I suppose, of trying to make it still fun and enjoyable, engaging, but not be like, remember in 1928 everything was great. Uh, it's not, yeah.
Well, it segues very nicely. We've got a comment from Helen Redman. She says, I am really enjoying your book, not yet at the end, which is great. We are not going to reveal
No
anything.
spoilers. Yeah,
I appreciate the friar's dry wit and Hartley's clumsy mistakes. For example, the friar's comment on which is the right church and Hartley capturing the sheep. Thank you for an entertaining story. I think that picks
thanks,
up
Alan.
I think just what we were talking about there. It's that sectarianism that you mentioned as well. Everything was not great in 1921. There were so many tectonic plates beneath the surface. One of them, Protestants versus Catholics, and that was just hinted at in that little extract that you.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting, especially like I think it's funny. It's not funny, but I found now with all of the sort of current discourse and the level that we're at, of calling out racism and trying to examine biases and all that, it's amazing to look back at, like, even when I was a kid, that like Italians were getting made fun of. Like if you remember uh, what's it, looking for Brandy and stuff like that. I'm like, wow, like it's sort of considered kind of like that's almost it's all in the past and everything. But like the Catholic and Protestant stuff, the very very slight discrepancies on which kind of Europeans were okay. I mean, my grandpa, who was always like Irish people and Welsh people and everything, I was just like, what? How can you keep up with all of these bizarre like grievances that you have about like
Yeah.
just having to mention it, blah blah blah. Of course he'd be like that. He's Welsh. I'm like, what does that even mean? Shut up.
Well, my family's part Italian, and I always I never forget my dad telling me that just remember a white supremacist will praise Greece and Rome, but will still call
Yeah,
you. So
yeah,
it makes no sense.
exactly.
Yeah.
And Kojinup, I mean, it was one of the first places, from as far as I can tell from my research, that had sort of like a sizable Italian population in the rural WA, which I found really interesting. And there's a character in Death Holds the Key who's Italian to kind of reflect that. But yeah, it's amazing, even without getting into sort of obviously when you have the Chinese immigration and all that sort of stuff. Even just the different types of European just hating on each other.
But 1928 was fine. Nothing to see here.
But nothing's everything's great.
Well, I've got a list here of your pool of suspects for who killed
Mm,
Fred O'Donnell.
lay it
And
on me.
so we've got Winifred,
Hmm.
Edith, Les Thompson, George and Mary, Hazel, Alan, and Will. No, sorry, and not Will. The Will is one of the reasons it could have been done. I
Yes.
don't have an exhaustive list. That's as many as I could grab. Uh, it all builds as well, without giving away too much. One of the classics. It's the parlor. We're heading to the big reveal at the end. Um, how did you seed these characters in a way that you could explore each of them? That you could give each of them a credible motive, but each of them also a red herring. And you mentioned that you planned this out quite in a quite detailed way. Did you have a map? Did you have like one of those boards with twine in between everything?
Charlie from Always Sunny having all those pins on the wall. Um, I have, so basically with this one and the last one, I did what I think most crime writers do. In fact, we, I've been to, done a bunch of panels now and a bunch of, the Perth Literature Festival and all that sort of stuff, talked to a lot of crime writers. And there's only been one. It was, I always forget her name now. And I feel bad for her because she's lovely. Karen Herbert. Karen Herbert, who was also a Freo Press author, who did the Rivermouth. And she's the only crime writer I know who said she started at the beginning and just worked to the end and kind of like figured it out in the way. And to me, that's psychotic. I'm sorry, Karen. But everyone else has done what I do, or I've done what everyone else does, in that you start at the end. I mean, because the end of the book is chronologically, it's the beginning, and it's that's the crux of everything. So basically, what I do is I'm starting with a crime that is difficult or unusual or easy to confuse or whatever. I'm starting with the crime itself, something that's interesting there, and then I think, how do we get there? Because I think we're all capable of killing someone if given the right set of circumstances. Unfortunately, I'd like to say not, but like until you're there, you probably don't know. And I think so. Here's the crime. How would this be done physically in terms of like what are the actual where do people have to be at what time, and how would that work out in a way that would be difficult to solve or whatever. And then I think what would get someone to that point where they are willing to not only kill someone but to do it in this bizarre way, or if it's a circumstance, if they're a victim of circumstance, then what moves the circumstances at that point. And then you sort of work backwards from there. Well, okay, why did they get pushed to that? And you kind of work backwards until you reach a point, I think, where you can start writing, if that makes sense. And yeah, and then I suppose with fleshing out people's motives, I mean, they're not based on like real life people. Mostly, they're mostly just parts of me, I suppose. Like they're mostly me putting myself in the shoes of what would a woman in this time period, in this set of circumstances, how would they feel and how would they react. I'm not one of the people who sort of tends to base to sort of fictionalize real characters and put them in there. But yeah, it's just a lot of trial and error and sort of working it out as you go along, I suppose.
Yeah. And what was the most enjoyable part of writing Death Holds the Key? Was it writing the friar, being the friar?
It's his dialogue. Honestly, it's the way it's just. Oh, and Winnie was a lot of fun because she's kind of she's someone who is astride those two worlds in the 20s, I suppose, where she's getting all the magazines and the books and the literature of like the flappers and the sort of bright young things in the UK, and getting all of this liberation and excitement and everything in one sense, but she's still stuck on the farm. So she's kind of this character who flips between sort of like being quite a rough and tumble worker on the farm to being sort of talking like she's the Duchess of wherever she is. So she's a lot of fun as well. But yeah, mainly the friar is the draw for me.
Did you have any material that you didn't use for the friar? Because he's quite verbose, and he's
Oh
also
man,
just fun.
he is. But I mean, see, the problem here is that Georgia Richter, who's my editor, she loves to talk this way and to work. Like we when we're in the editing process, we send each other snippets from silly books we're reading from and these puns and these sort of things, and we just go down these huge tangents. So if like she would absolutely enable me if I wanted to just go on for pages and pages and pages. But yeah, we both had to kind of, harden up and cut some stuff. Definitely, there's in this one, in the last book, I can just waffle on like the friar for ages, and have fun with it. And there gets a point where you do need to sort of just. I often have other characters interrupt him, or just like kind of get sick of him and just be like, all right, shut up, we get it. Because he loves the sound of his own voice, definitely.
What's made him like this? Because he's quite brave. Like,
Why are you like this?
why do you like this? I mean, a mendicant friar is someone who has given away all worldly possessions and relies on the kindness of strangers to feed and clothe him. And he's even given up his own name. This is quite, it's courageous, but
So yeah, it's a complex one because there's a bit about it in the previous book, as well, and it's one that's like, it's not a spoiler as such, but there's an overarching narrative. He's the only thing that sort of ties this book and the previous one together, and the next one, which I've started working on. There's kind of like an arc, but basically he is someone who is not cut out to be in 1928 or 1927 or you know any time period beyond before now, basically. And he's very, very sensitive. He's the kind of person that I imagine. So, I mean, if I think about someone like me being back in that time period, back in an earlier time when you had to be, a man's man or be a priest or a teacher, basically, and even if you're a teacher, like my grandpa was a teacher and he was, beating the shit out of kids. Like he was telling me in his memoirs, he's like, oh, the kids, they don't want to learn. You got to smack them. You got to hit them. I was like,
yeah,
please don't do that. You shouldn't do that. Um, so I think he's someone who kind of, through his just natural compassion and his natural sort of like desire not to sort of hurt anyone and not to be and not to be rough and not to be part of, he's really kind of like a gentle guy, and maybe even a soft guy, we might call him. So he kind of went into the priesthood more as like, well, here's a way that I can maybe try and help people, maybe read books and sort of not have to shoot anyone in a war or do hard labor or what have you. And he and then he sort of has a couple of like traumatic experiences, which I won't sort of spoil because they're in the first book and kind of maybe in upcoming ones, that lead him to sort of to go away to think, basically. So he's given up everything. He's wandering around. He's looking for some meaning, and then gradually his sort of story is one towards coming to terms with who he is and what the world is like, and trying to make a more comfortable life for himself that is not taking away from others or hurting others.
just as a real code switch of a question, Alex, can you recall a moment of reading a crime story or a mystery story or anything where you just knew you were hooked, that this is what you love to read and this is what you want to create?
Yeah, I mean, I was always a massive reader. I was always, I used to probably be more into science fiction and fantasy and stuff like that. The first sort of attempts I did writing when I was like sort of 18, 19 would have been in that genre. But my partner and I, now wife, and I were traveling around the world teaching English together. We were English as second language teachers. We taught in China, Mexico, the Republic of Georgia, as opposed to the US state of Georgia, which is confusing because she's from America. So people always think, oh yeah, Georgia, like Atlanta. No.
Stalin's home, yeah.
Pardon?
Stalin's hometown, right? You went to
Old mate Joe, yeah, old mate Joey Steele. They're very weird about Stalin over there. He's kind of like hometown hero, and you're like, was he a hero? Like, he was a pretty bad dude, and they're like, nah. Anyway, so we were going on for a few years, teaching English, and I was just reading so much English because during the day, obviously we were in other countries, we were learning other languages, we were not speaking sort of at a high level beyond like hello, good morning, teaching to learners. And so at night I was just plowing through books to get my fill of that kind of higher level language. And basically I just filled my Kindle. Normally I have paper books. I'm not a Kindle guy, but when you're traveling, you need to have a Kindle, or something that's easier, or you're constantly swapping books. So I had everything that was out of copyright, basically. Everything I had was written 100 years before. So it was all the complete works of Conan Doyle, and it was a lot of Agatha Christie's older stuff, and Marsh and Josephine Tay and all that kind of jazz. So that's kind of how I sort of switched. I'd always been partial to it, but I switched from being like, oh, I read a bit of everything to I just read, like 200 whodunits in a year kind of thing. And they were all, 200 whodunits and also, like P.G. Wodehouse and all that sort of jazz and Evelyn Waugh. So I really got trapped in the early 20th century in a locked room.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's heavy dope, Alex. That's wonderful. Yeah. And so from there, how did you first come to try to write in this style or in this genre, which led you to Death Leads the Station, which now leads you to Death Holds the Key?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, I tried other stuff before, and it didn't have that. I was trying to figure out like why. Like I feel like I'm a decent. So I'm a English teacher, but also I studied journalism and I was a copywriter for a long time. So I was like, I'm a writer for a living. I can write and I get paid for it. Why is it so hard for me to write a story? And I figured out that I need that sort of structure. And in my year of 200 whodunits, I was like, well, this is a hell of a structure. This is I've read 200 of these things, and it works every time. It never gets old. So here's what I need. It's almost like having a clear set of instructions. It's almost like assembling an IKEA furniture as opposed to just trying to make something yourself out of a raw block of wood. You're still doing work and you're still thinking, and you later on you paint it and you put your own twist on it, but it really has that clear set of steps that you need. And so I was, whodunits I was like, I'll try it this way. And then obviously I'd never lived in the UK. I've been to the UK for about 2 weeks, and they're all set over there. And I thought, what would this look like set in Australia? There are, of course, some great ones, especially in that period. There's all of the Solari Gentile ones, and I've forgotten her name now, but the Miss Fisher's murder mysteries.
Yes, yeah.
Kerry Greenwood. So yeah, there's definitely like, it's not like, oh, no one's done this before, but I thought, how could I put my twist on it? And
This way it never gets
then
old. Yeah.
exactly, it never gets old. And as I mentioned, my dad's dad had asked me to help him write his memoirs earlier, and he grew up in the same sort of area where I set Death Leaves the Station. A little bit later, he was born 1926, so he was growing up, a bit later than this happened. But it was an interesting time period, I thought, and an interesting place because of all that distance. You can have nowadays with GPS, you could have someone, GPS and CCTV and all the rest of it. Someone could get killed, and you've got all these mountains of evidence. If you were riding in Mullewa in 1927, someone could just take a wrong turn home from the pub and you never see them again. So yeah, I think that all sort of came together at a period in time that led me to give it a go.
That's one. Let's say as well, when I Googled Death Holds the Key for some research, Revelation 1:18 came up from the Bible.
Interesting.
I hold the keys of death. It took me down a bit of a path. I was like, whoa, okay. Yeah, that's a weird way of asking the question. Why continue with the death? Death holds the key. Death leaves.
I'm trying to remember if that came up in our pre. I don't think it did, which is interesting because we do use a lot of there's a fair amount of biblical stuff in this one. From the Catholic Bible, not from the Protestant. There it is again. But basically the first book wasn't originally called Death Leaves the Station. It was called, my working title was The Stone Pillow, based on the way that the sort of victim in that one is killed. But Freo Press, when they picked up the book, they said, if it's a murder mystery, it needs to have death or murder in the title. people like that. Like it's a classic, you want, it's like, especially of that era, if it's something now, you have like the girl on the train and the girl with the dragon tattoo, and the ones that are a bit more, the fashion has changed, but definitely for a golden age, as they call it, murder mystery, it needs to have death or murder or body or something in the title. So we brainstormed for ages, and we came up with Death Leaves the Station, which was kind of funny because it's a sheep station. A lot of people they'll read it and they go, oh yeah, I really liked it, but there's no train station. And I'm like, yeah, it's a pastoral station. Yeah, didn't really think about that till afterwards with the leaves the station, especially. It sounds very train-like. Um, but yeah, and then we thought if we're, continuing this on, not as a, it's not, as I said, you don't need to read them in order or anything, but like they are related. It's not like we can say, it's not like the Sherlock Holmes or the Poirot mysteries because the dude doesn't have a name. So to tie it together, we thought we'd keep this structure of death verbs the noun, as we call it. So death verbs the noun in both of them, and in the next one, death will also verb the noun.
Fantastic. The death murder mystery, would that be the
Yeah.
so is how many books are going to be in the cycle with Fryer, with the man?
Depends if I get bored, or what happens to me. But I suppose I'm planning. I've got the next one sort of worked out, and I've just sort of started on actually sort of writing it. So that's pretty sorted. And then I've probably two or three more after that, depending on whether people get sick of them and I get sick of them and go and do something else. So we'll see, I suppose.
I hope colloquially the series becomes known as the death verbs the nouns.
everyone's verbing the noun.
Verbing the noun. That's wonderful. Alex, you mentioned you've become a father in between in the lead up to book one, and then book two. That's the time where
that's my reality. Yeah.
what's writing for you like now? It's you had your time to dive into the 200 books, but now it's like right.
Yeah, it's harder. It's definitely harder. Especially because it's basically after she goes to bed on the few days where I have energy. I talk to people, and so often you talk to other writers, and they have a routine, and they have a place and a time, and they make a certain type of tea that they drink and whatever. And it's literally, this one was written like when my daughter was napping at 2 a.m. when she'd woken me up, and we'd got her back down, but I couldn't get back to sleep. On the bus on the way to work, like with my laptop on my knees, like just literally any time I can get a second and my brain isn't completely fogged over. That's when I write. So yeah, it's very haphazard. Some days I write, I sit down and I'm in the zone and I can smash out, chapters and chapters. And some days I will just type one sentence and then delete it because it's shit. So it's really it's really no rhyme or reason, no style, no just as it comes.
It seems passion undimmed, interest undimmed.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
But there's also, I'm sure what you have. Oh, sorry, I was going to say the sort of thing you have where in the past I'd be reading books because I had heard they were good or because I'd been wanting to read it for ages, and now mostly I'm just reading the books of the people that I'm going to do a panel with. That's what I have time. I'm just like, people go, "Oh, why did you choose to read that one?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm doing I'm doing a library event with them in 2 weeks, and I want to make sure that I've read their book so I can. I'm not just like, hi,
Yeah.
man.
Hey man, how's it going? Yeah. I will say it is one of the perks of hosting Libby. I get I try to read 4 books a month, which sounds ambitious, but
Yeah. Definitely with the kids, it,
yeah.
it does sound ambitious.
But I have one. Yeah, I have a book on tap, and then I get to talk to someone amazing. So I really appreciate you coming on tonight. So
thank you.
we've got like 6 minutes left. So let's take it all the way. Does anybody have a question for Alex? If you do, please chuck it in the chat, and I will weave it in. But let's go back to an earlier question. It's from 05015009.
Catchy name.
Does the monk reflect elements of your own personality? I think we can say yes, but also was there parts of him that you found interesting to explore?
Yeah, I mean, he does. Everyone, as I said, everyone is elements of me basically in these books. They're all kind of just different because I think we all contain multitudes, as you say. The monk represents my love of people, my desire to find hope and meaning, even maybe if you don't have any sort of religious belief, you're sort of trying to make sense of the world, and also my inability to shut up. He loves, as I said, he loves the sound of his own voice. That's something that unfortunately is definitely a flaw in me as well. I'll just, if I'm with someone at a party or something, I won't shut up. I'll just be talking and go, and another thing, and I saw this on Wikipedia, and then they'll have to be like, shut
Yeah.
up, man, that's great. I have to go to the toilet, and they'll just walk into, go and talk to someone else. And I'm like, hey, they're not going to the toilet at all. So yeah, that's the part of me. That's my outlet for just pure waffle. Essentially, is the monk as well.
Well, thinking of that, I have a kind of, this is a funny question, but does murder bring out the best in people? Yeah, because I mean, these stories are essentially quite dark, but it also means some pretty cool things happen. And does murder bring out the best in people? Is that why we love this genre? Is that why we're
I
interested?
I think it can definitely. I think any kind of crisis can really be revealing and kind of make people take stock and show people's true colors and all the rest of it. Um, it can also bring out the worst in people, definitely. But these books, I mean, they call them cozy crime because they're not so much about the murder, really, are they? And it's not like a noir or a hard boiled thing where it's all blood and guts. It's usually quite demure, off screen kind of deaths and things like that. Off screen, that's not a screen, is it? Off page. Um, um, I think it's. I think maybe more than the murder, the desire to kind of know the truth and get back to stable ground and all that kind of stuff can really be revealing and bring out the maybe the dominant traits in someone's personality, the good or the bad.
And as a reader itself, I always try to. I know I'm not trying to knock the practice, but you're trying to beat the writer in a sense. You're like trying to figure it out before the end, or at least convince yourself that you've figured it out before the end. Because as you say, it never gets old.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
are you that kind of reader, or do you just go with it?
I used to be. I think in all of the time I've been reading and all the whodunits I read, I think I've guessed the ending once. I'm actually really bad at it. I'm terrible. So I kind of gave up, and now I just enjoy it. And I don't even like I don't even go, ooh, maybe that could be something. I'm just like, don't even think about it. Just breeze through, and then they have the parlor scene, which you talked about. I love a parlor scene, and they go through all of the they recap the evidence, and they accuse different people, and they weave and turn, and I just enjoy it. And then they'll go like, this is how it's done, and I'm like, awesome. I don't even try anymore because I'm so bad at it, and because I think it's more. I mean, it definitely can be fun to try and sort it out and try and guess it. But I think in another way, it's just kind of fun to let the author sort of carry you along and take you where they're going to go.
My mother's obsessed with murder mysteries, and she reads them backwards. She'll read the parlor scene first, and then go to the
Unhinged,
unhinged.
absolutely unhinged.
She's like, well,
But it is. I mean, when you reread them, like it is amazing. Like, yeah, if you now know how it happened and how it's going, it is kind of cool to go back and be like, oh, I see how they were like planting the seeds there, and like from a craft perspective, I see how that they kind of detracted, or like took people's attention away from this person while still because like the rules of the game is basically that people have to be able to guess the ending. Like
ah,
all the information has to be in there, right? Like you can't just be like, oh, and by the way, I didn't tell you that this person has has poisoned fingernails, and that's how they did. Like it has to all
yeah.
be possible to guess.
Like,
Yeah,
look, first thing that popped into my mind. I'm sorry, but I have two young daughters. It's like in Frozen. There's a bit where like one guy is like instantaneously evil.
yeah,
He's a good dude, and then he just goes. And you're
yeah.
like, where did that come from?
And you
Like,
do, yeah. You watch it again, and you're like, were there any? Did they? And I don't feel like they did really presage that at all.
so we've got a comment here from Malish. She says, not a question, but a comment. Loving this chat. Thank you. I'll take it. I haven't quite finished Death Leaves the Station, but no, I'll enjoy it. And the next one even more by getting a bit of an insight into the writing backstory. Thank you. That's
Oh,
great.
lovely. Thank you. That is
So
great.
I guess a final question. What can we expect in number three? So
It's a retelling of Frozen in Fremantle. Yeah, I did just watch it today. Actually, that's what oh gosh, no, it's more. It's all set in Fremantle. This one, so it's moving away from a country setting. It's a bit more of a Fremantle back in the day, very gritty and grotty. So I suppose it is getting a bit darker, a bit more. They're probably a bit more of an urban setting with characters who don't know each other as well and are a bit more, I suppose, darker in a lot of ways. But it's still going to be a lot of fun. Obviously, it starts off with someone being harpooned, which is unusual.
so
Unless things change in the process, but that's where I'm at the moment.
I really look forward to the next installment of Death Verbs the Noun. And William Budislek says, yes, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts. Death Verbs the Noun, terrific.
Thanks, William.
Death Lots of
And
well on the Libby app. You've got 700 loans just for this month alone, which is fantastic. So
that's
thank
cool.
you very
Yeah,
much
very
for
nice. Thank
participating.
you so much for having me.
It's been great to have you, Alex. Thank you.
Lovely to chat. Hey,
Yeah.
cool.
Thank you,
And
everybody, for joining us tonight.
Julia Lawrenson next month.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we've got Julia Lawrenson's How to Avoid a Happy Life. These are always reversed. So,
Yeah, true.
so looking forward to this chat. But for now, let's just say thank you to Alex for coming on and for sharing all the insights from Death Holds the Key. Death verbs the noun. Thank you.
Verbing all those nouns. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. I'll see you soon. Thank you, everybody,
Cheers.
and have a
Bye.
good night.